stones for sticking through Keir Starmer's speech and coming to our event today, which we're doing in partnership with GS1 UK. And it's been a fantastic journey so far with them. And culminating this brilliant report, my colleague Hana will be speaking about in a few moments. I'm Andrew O'Brien, I'm Director of Policy and Impact at Demos. For those who don't know, Demos is an independent cross-party think tank created about 30 years or so ago, and we pride ourselves on putting the public at the heart of policy making and looking at those big systemic challenges which we need to tackle, and trying to develop innovative, interesting ideas and solutions to those problems. And as we heard from Keir Starmer's speech this afternoon, this government is very much about tackling the hard problems, and there is no harder challenge than trying to get public sector procurement to work effectively, as Meg will know from her many years on the Public Accounts Committee, and now I'm sure looking the other side of the equation on the Treasury Select Committee as the elected chair there. And we've got, as you can see, a fantastic panel of speakers, and I will just quickly run through those. So Hana, my colleague on my right, the report holder, Alistair Strathern, who is a member of Parliament for my notes here. It's a long day. Hitchin and PPS for the Chancellor Exchequer. It really is the last day.
I think we are all absolutely there right now. So
two constituencies with an
it's a useful reminder for me as well.
No. And most importantly, PPS to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and who's got a pretty tough job herself. Dame Meg Hillier, the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Sarah Atkins from GS1 UK, and Lord Shoaf from West Midlands Combined Authority. And as you can see, we've got central government, we've got regional authorities, so we've got a really interesting range of experiences. The format will be my colleague Hana will talk about the report and the work we've been doing. I'll then ask Meg and Alistair to say a few words in their reflections. Then I'll pass over to Laura and Sarah to give their thoughts and their response to that. And then we'll open up to you in the audience for a bit of Q&A. And given that it is the last event, we'll try and keep this simple. And I know some speakers have to finish a bit earlier as well. So thank you very much for your patience. So Hana, over to you to tell us about how we're going to fix this challenging real 300 billion opportunity.
An easy question to answer. So yes, thank you. Hopefully I don't forget my name like that. Okay. We're all in a great place now. Had a great conference. So yeah, I'm going to tell you a bit about the report. As Andrew says, I'll try to keep it short. Tell you a bit about the context of the report, why we wrote it, the kind of new vision that I set out in the report for what social value in public procurement should look like, and I'll explain what social value looks like for some of you who may not know much about social value, and then I'll just talk you through very high level some of my policy recommendations. So for those of you who are less familiar with social value, essentially it was a concept that was established with the Social Value Act of 2012 that Andrew helped to write, so no pressure for me writing this report with his support, and it's basically trying to get public sector procurement to be a lever for pushing businesses to create additional social, environmental and economic benefit beyond kind of whatever they're contracted for. So if you're a business and you want a public sector contract, you have to prove that you're going to produce some sort of additional social, environmental and economic benefit. And so the kind of £300 billion opportunity point is that public procurement spend is over £300 billion. There's a lot of money there that you could do a lot of good with if we're doing it right. The concern that kind of led us to write this report is that we're not always doing it right yet. And so I'll talk through a bit about what that looks like. But it sort of led to us naming the report, as you'll see, Taming the Wild West, which is a slightly dramatic title that Andrew with his drama came up with. And you do have to add some drama to the report about public procurement, obviously. But also, it's very much something that we heard from people in the sector, and we've kind of had a lot of positive reception to it. A lot of people are saying, yes, it really is a Wild West. And what we mean by that is there is a lack of standardization currently going on. So, businesses are writing each contract anew, having to apply different standards, different frameworks on different levels with different kind of public sector bodies that they're working with. Procurers sort of aren't able to compare and contrast data because it's not standardized, and so it's not consistently used. there's not transparency about the data as well. So even if it was consistent, they wouldn't really be able to compare it. And so that's kind of another problem. There's not really enough accountability as well to make sure that businesses are actually delivering the social value that they've promised they will deliver. And so that kind of led us to create this Wild West language around it. And I think there's a lot of risks with this, obviously, and one of which is we kind of just don't really know how we're doing on social value right now as a country, and that's obviously important for the government if it's going to decide, where it's going to invest more and where we're doing well, where we're doing not well. That's a big problem. But also there's a risk of a loss of trust, and we see this in the US with the ESG, for example. There've been lots of greenwashing scandals, and there's evidence to suggest that, when there's more greenwashing claims, there is less investment in those kind of sustainable funds. So there's a real impact of a loss of trust in this, and we really don't want people to completely lose trust in the social value agenda. That would be bad, because we think it is really important. So the report sets out a new vision for social value for that very reason, and we did a literature and evidence review. We did roundtable one-on-one interviews with policymakers, with businesses, and we did some polling with consumers and with business leaders as well, just to make sure we had a good lay of the land. And so the new vision has 4 pillars that I set out, and one of the key things that runs through all those pillars is technology. So we feel that technology can really help push this agenda further and faster, and there are a lot of case studies in the report which conveniently are located all around them if you'd like to have a look, that show kind of how technology can really help this agenda. But so just to sort of give you an overview of the 4 pillars, the first one is standardization and interoperability. So as I've mentioned, there's a lack of standardization. We think there needs to be more of this, and in the recommendations that I'll sort of talk through, we give a sense of kind of what this could look like. But also these standards need to be interoperable, so they need to kind of work with other standards. So there's no use having loads of conflicting standards, and ideally our standards would work on a global level even. So that's a thing to kind of aim for. The second pillar is transparency. So as I said, there's a lack of this, and it's really important. So it's important for procurers to see how businesses are doing. As I said, it's important for government to see how we're doing on social value. It's important for taxpayers to see how their money is being spent, and we know there's low trust from taxpayers in kind of public procurement, especially with the scandals that happened during the pandemic, for example. Transparency is really key. The third pillar is capability. So we also saw that there's a bit of a capacity gap in terms of both from the business side and procurer side. There's issues in terms of knowing what social value is, understanding it, and also the resources to kind of actually carry it out well. So we need to fill that capability gap. Final pillar is incentivization. So that's kind of a simple, self-explanatory one. We need to incentivize businesses to actually do this stuff. And so that will push forward all the other pillars. So just to then quickly finish off with sort of overview of the recommendations. The first one is a simple kind of but powerful one, strengthen the legislation. So currently central government is required to account for rather than just consider social value in its contracts, whereas local government and regional government, for example, aren't. And so we think because there's a bit more of a confusing landscape on the local and regional government levels, as we found, we think that needs to be brought up to that level, so they need to account for rather than consider social value in their contracts. The second one is basically trying to address this issue of standardization, trying to find a bit of a level where we have some standardization but also some flexibility by getting combined authorities on a regional authority level. And I'm really interested to hear what Laura has to say about this, getting combined authorities to develop social value strategies, and that then public bodies, they're good public bodies, the public bodies underneath in their area then need to kind of have regard to that. And so there's some standardization kind of on that regional level, but there's also a bit of flexibility. And these strategies would be informed by citizen panels, so getting the people who live in the area to actually contribute to the question of what is socially valuable to them, which I think is really important. And thirdly, the third recommendation is build on Labour's commitments to create an office of value for money, which the idea is that basically you'd have to consider value for money, that public contracts would give before they're contracted, and this would be advised by a social value council. This is a commitment that's been made. And so I basically fleshed out a bit what the social value council could do. And one thing is that it could create a trusted social value data task force, and this could help sort of standardise the measurement of social value data and also encourage tech innovation. So there's a few sort of techie recommendations in that one. The fourth one is to build on commitments in the upcoming Procurement Act, which basically one of the kind of key commitments there is that they want to publicly publish information on public sector contracts, so there's more transparency, and we think that social value should be a really key part of that, so there's sort of recommendations related to that. And now that the implementation of the Procurement Act has been pushed back to February, it gives us a bit more time for the government to read these recommendations and implement kind of some plans in line with kind of the missions and their new strategies. Final recommendation, and I will stop talking, is to add a new requirement in the Companies Act of 2006, so that bigger businesses have to have a social value officer in their business. And what this would do is sort of place the burden on bigger businesses, which we think is more fair because SMEs already face lots of barriers in terms of procurement, as many of you will know. But also it means that it will sort of diffuse capability through kind of new social value networks into smaller businesses and also into kind of private sector procurement areas that are much less familiar with social value. We think that social value could really just be an area that the UK can take a lot of leadership on, as it has already. So I think it's a really good opportunity for us then.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Really interesting thoughts and recommendations there, and as Hannah mentioned, Labour's already committed to creating an office value for money, and we know that with the COVID contracts and kind of trying to dig into the impact of and tracking the funding there, that making sure there is that transparency and accountability has already formed a part of government's plan. So hopefully some of this can kind of go with the flow of where the government's already taking things. I'm going to pass over to you, Meg, to see if you have any thoughts on both some of those report recommendations and findings, but also your general reflections on the state procurement.
Well, shall we start with, is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah, that's fine. So starting with the state of procurement, well, when I first joined the Public Accounts Committee in 2011, it was in a very dire state. And I remember being a Home Office Minister before that, and the Home Office had been a joke of Whitehall, and one of the things I focused on was trying to get procurement better. And one of the problems was it was both ways, really. There were a lot of problems with how it was done, and not lack of professionalism in Whitehall. But then businesses would, play that a bit because they knew they were dealing with people who weren't doing it very well. Now it's got a lot better since. There is now a team we're in the Cabinet Office, but the Cabinet Office has been shrunk down. So I'm not sure where they'll end up, but that actually advises and trains basically people to get skilled in procurement. So we actually have procurement specialists in Whitehall, so it's quite timely really as we get to government that we have that there are better professionals, because you could get promoted in civil service endlessly without ever having actually run a big project or done a properly professional procurement. So that is a definite step in the right direction, but certainly national, and I think I'll leave the local stuff to Laura because she'll know that better than me. But there's some of this does cut across all parts of government, local and national. But the contracts are written and bids come in from the larger companies. It is even with G-Cloud, there's some real challenges about small businesses bidding for business. And that's an opportunity because if you could get a £100,000 contract, just an SME in a particular part of the country, that's a lot of money for some businesses. That can help grow that business, give them some solidity, a backbone, an opportunity for them to say, well, we work for the government. This is another call. It gives them a calling card to other businesses to say we've got some weight behind us. And there's the tension. This I think applies to people at local level as well. It's easier to put out a bid and just deal with the big guys who know what they're doing, as they would phrase it, rather than having to have lots and lots of bids. So often bids are written in a way that just preclude, well, certainly there have been in the past, that precludes a lot of people applying. So I think there are real challenges still about how to get that procurement of taxpayers' money being spent by national government on public services, but the very few companies are doing this. And at different times, I could give you the chapter, but maybe I should write the book, but about how the Public Accounts Committee has looked at these things. But one time after the Carillion collapse, we were asked to look at all the papers dealing with procurement because the government had a sort of a way of looking at companies and assessing them. And it was really interesting, actually how few strategic suppliers there are in governments around. I haven't done the recent count, 28 to 30, depending on, because it's over £1 million expenditure with government. So it's not very many really when you think, and a little niche of those are sort of specialist defence, so they kind of will always be, you know, quite big fry and also quite specialist. But the rest were the companies that you can guess, you know, the big FM and generalist suppliers who then contract lower down and scoop a bit off along the way. So actually some more direct procurement with some smaller companies is something that's a kind of prize that every government, well, lots of people talk about, and then it's actually quite hard to deliver. The other thing that I think is really important that you bring out very clearly, Hana, in the work is data. You know, this is something, when I shared the Public Accounts Committee, every report we did said the data is poor and the data needs to improve. Increasingly, actually, to be fair to permanent secretaries, they themselves began to realise this, but it's like turning an ocean liner. There's something like 13 different ways of recording the country you live in this country. I mean, because you've got the United Kingdom, England, Wales, UK, GB. So if you're just trying to read across on things like that, that makes it very hard. So if you translate that to how you measure social value, what you think you're collecting the right data, and actually if you are, it's not necessarily easy to read. It's a technology can definitely play a part there, but we do need some standardisation in order to be able to measure this. And as a co-op MP, I think the whole work that Hazel Beers did and others on this is something we need to definitely revisit. So we need to make sure though that social value itself, or look at social value, it's easy to deliver for different companies because different size companies have challenges in how they can deliver on it. And some have said to me, look, with a big contract, it's easy to deliver. With smaller contracts, you're trying to work out the value of what you're spending and therefore what you should be delivering in the Social Value Act. And sometimes it's difficult, and they're talking to me about whether they could amalgamate to get several companies could work together to support, for instance, one apprentice or something. And I think there are issues there that could be looked at. Again, if we're trying to involve smaller companies and or large SMEs are a way of really, I think, and Alistair might have some views about this from the Treasury, but are ways of unlocking economic growth. So I think the transparency part is absolutely key as well, because if you're not, if you're measuring apples and pears, you can't really know what you're getting. Then if you're not transparent about it, then what? And when I look at how some investment funds now have done a very good job of explaining what they're doing in terms of the green issues and net zero, they can really be rigorous about what they're checking, but a number do still greenwash. So the same happens in social value, and I don't think there's enough incentive. Not enough. I'm not saying we should have sticks. I think we should be encouraging people rather than punishing them, as people are on this journey, even though it's been over a decade, to get it better before we start punishing people with sticks. But I think it's too easy to get away with it if you don't really want to, because it's really very easy to measure. In terms of the Office for Value, because that's a temporary thing, but I think this idea of social value councillors definitely worth exploring. I think it could also be a good practice exercise. So rather than being a social sort of it could be it's a data centre in a sense, isn't it? Really measuring and assessing things, but actually giving advice, best practice, how to's. And I think we don't do enough of that. I think government, hopefully, with the change of government, will want to be a bit more transparent about how you can do things, everything from bidding for big contracts to how you deliver on social value, which is obviously critical. But then just really, I think probably, in a way, the raising director of this whole session is the headline, there's an awful lot of money that could be unlocked, £300 billion opportunity, and there really is an opportunity to get some of that money into delivering social value in our communities. And Keir spoke just now about what makes Britain great, and actually it is making sure, one part of that is making sure that communities see the benefit of what's happening. And we have had gone through torrid times with COVID, cost of living crisis, and a real demoralisation in many towns and cities around the UK, regions of the UK. They don't feel like they're getting anything. What happened to levelling up? Nothing really. So people need to see that they're getting something for it. So part of it, if you can have the transparency and make the social value council something that also proselytises, communicates, tells the story about what you're getting. Your tax money is being spent on this, and this is what you're also getting back. Not just the service it's delivering, but it's actually getting those jobs and opportunities in your community too. I think we could be on a win, and I think this is, if I can lobby the Treasury in the form of Alistair, it's a potential cheap win for the Treasury relative to the cost that we have to give.
Thanks very much. You probably have a lot of lobbying. You've had a lot of lobbying, I imagine, in the last few days. But any thoughts on, obviously Rachel Reeves has spoken a lot about getting value for money and treating every penny well, and social values again is a bit about making stretching every pound as far as possible. So it feels like a lot of alignment. But what's your thoughts?
Definitely, and look, last afternoon of the conference, it's always tough to want whether you're going to have anything of value left to say. Last afternoon of the conference, speaking on a panel about public sector procurement, after someone with pretty much unrivaled experience on driving this exact work in rec machines, means that my experience is a little bit more limited. So I'm going to try and outline 4 things that I think are worth highlighting and reinforcing, or just called out there. The first, I think you alluded to there, is the timeliness of this. I think both from a public trust point of view, in terms of making sure we really are assuring people that we are spending their money in the best possible way to deliver the outcomes they will want us to be working towards. But also, given the constrained fiscal backdrop, the fact that we are going to have to make sure every penny we spend is as coherent as possible with the widest number of our objectives that we want to hit over the next 5 years. Social value in the work in this report and the work that I know a lot of others do in the space at the moment is going to obviously have to be an important part of how we look at that and how we drive that work forwards. And so that time assisted report is great, and there's already been some interesting kind of high level announcements from Labour, for example, how we want to spend our food budget to make sure that we're supporting British farming. But I would imagine going forwards, this and other aspects of public procurement reform are going to have to be an important part of how we ensure not just we're building trust in what we're doing, but we're really maximising the benefit of every single penny we're spending when there are so many challenges that we know we need to show material improvement on over the next 5 years. Secondly, I think really is that bigger point, and that's both ensuring we've got rigor in the quality of the people who are doing procurement for us at every level of government, so they can really have that strong, robust relationship with the people procuring from, but also in data as well, so that we can properly assess and measure it. Because having been involved in social value work at a local council before, you've seen social value done very, very well. But you can also see social value done in a pretty much non-existent way. And so making sure that we're doing social value in a way that is truly incremental and growing the value of what is being done, rather than simply describing the long-existing and long-standing value of what has been done the same way for a very long time, is so important. And I think data and the rigor and quality of the people we've got doing our procurement are so important. And politicians, you can hold those people to account, challenge them, and make sure they're doing everything they can to drive forward that agenda is going to be an important part of our role, I think, in government. A great part of the role that's been doing so badly for chairing the committee over the last few years. Linked to that, I think, is making sure we're doing this in a way that works for our wider objectives too. I think that's rightly highlighted some of the real barriers that existed for a very long time now to smaller, medium-sized enterprise access, public sector procurement. That's it's true in local government, or as a councillor, as it's true in central government too. So ensuring we're doing this in a standardised and interoperable way as possible is going to be really key to making sure that this is, at worst, not adding to the barriers to access that a lot of small firms have already faced when thinking about public sector procurement, and ideally trying to think of other ways we can do it creatively to break some of those barriers down too in the process. Because we know government contracts and the stability they bring can be vital for those SMEs that are looking to scale up, have got quite volatile customer bases, and don't always have access to the length of contracts that we as a state are able to provide as a pretty strong customer, either locally or in national government. I think if we can get all of those things right, there's a really exciting story we can hopefully tell, and that underlying point of the story we can tell is so important too. Because when I was a local councillor, people would simply eyes glazed over if we were trying to tell stories about the value that large developments, large investments in infrastructure would bring in terms of jobs, in terms of apprenticeships, in terms of wider social work, because they just didn't believe it. They didn't buy it, they didn't see it, they didn't feel that was an opportunity for them, for their community, and they thought it was just another bit of a sales pitch designed to force something on that they didn't want to see. If this is going to be not just a way of driving value, but also helping to drive understanding of why some of the big chunky infrastructure decisions we're going to have to make are actually good for communities, are actually providing localised benefits, making sure that people believe that, people feel that, and people have got line of sight to those changes and how they're benefiting their communities locally is going to be so important. But I think there's some interesting thoughts in this report too from Demos about how the mechanisms that have that we should all be reflecting on. But on that note, I will pause to allow others a chance to reflect.
Thank you very much. Some great comments there. Laura, I'm going to come over to you and give us a perspective from the Combined Authority. I know you've been doing some really interesting work around inclusive growth and social value as well. So, yeah.
So thank you. So there's a lot. Can you hear me? That's just the same. I'm quite loud. Anyway, there's a lot of things that have already been said that I completely agree with. But I did promise Hana I'd try to spice it up at 4 o'clock on the last day. I think this is one of the biggest privileges of the job that I get to do, which is actually to think about how the money we spend makes a difference in the place that I work and where everybody who comes to work for us cares passionately about. Our budget for next year at the West Midlands Combined Authority is just short of about £1 billion. It's just over £400 million of revenue funding and about 600 in capital funding. So that is a huge amount of money that is flowing through our organization. I'll try to bring to life one of the challenges I think that I've heard articulated. So one of the budgets that we run is on adult skills. And one of the challenges that we have in parts of our community is that some of the skills that are needed before we can even come on to other skills are things like English as a second language. We really want to work with community-based groups to deliver this. They know A, who's on their patch, B, the skills they need, C, often they're the people who speak the same language, they've got trust in the community, they can bring people through. But the way that the sort of trade-off between and that tension between being able to use public money to invest in a very small micro company versus what we have to report back to government are completely at odds with each other. We cannot, our procurement rules don't even allow us to invest in some of that stuff, which we really want to do. The last thing we want to do is to give money to a national firm who's going to parachute in an English as a second language course that was designed somewhere else that doesn't reflect our community's needs. So at a real micro level, that's the way that manifests itself in a region. The other side of that is we are really committed to investing in companies who invest in social value, right? So investing in our community-based organizations. We have a whole program to get them ready to even bid for some of these contracts and even be able to think about getting the paperwork together, because we require a lot of paperwork, because we should. Because we're spending your taxpayer dollars, so we have to be responsible. But that means then that some of the small organizations are just not equipped in order to bid in for it. So we spend a lot of time trying to bridge that gap, trying to build that expertise within our communities and our community resources so that they have the capability to bid in. And then we have an inclusive growth framework in the West Midlands. We adopted it around sort of 2018. It's not wildly dissimilar to the sort of Kate Rayworth donut economics model, which is about power and participation and health and education and well-being and affordability and safe places. And we use that as the wrapper around which we make decisions around procurement. Now, we can't yet tackle some of those issues around working with some of the really micro businesses. But we do define that as a region about this is how we expect businesses who operate and who use money from the combined authority to operate. They have to operate within an inclusive growth framework. Because we often talk about it in the West Midlands. We can have all the investment that we might want, inward investment, FDI, all sounds fantastic. But if those jobs are being taken by people who live out in, other parts of the country, and they're driving dirty diesel cars into the center of our cities, and those jobs aren't going to local people, then what are we changing? Like, we're not doing anything really for the people that live in our place. So that inclusive growth framework is about making sure that our economy grows, that it grows and benefits the region at the same time. So we use that to define it. But I do really want to reiterate this point about we have to be really clear nationally about what we mean by social value, because what we measure is what we mean, right? So if we're not clear about what we mean, then we can't measure it properly. We can't have the data properly to know if we're having that sort of impact outside of those areas. I think citizen panels are great, came out of the report. We have a citizens panel in the West Midlands, but I do think one area, again, just to be sort of provocative, one area where local authorities, combined authorities can be much better is about how we talk to people in our places. I don't think the public sector has yet grasped this full range of tools that are available around genuine, meaningful engagement with our communities. And we still feel quite distant from being able to really get in at a community level and understand what those issues are. I think we still use very traditional means that aren't necessarily the best way. So it's been really difficult to know, what that social value means to that community, if that makes sense. But it's a huge opportunity. And, again, whether it's at a local level, a regional level, or a national level, it is billions and billions of pounds. And for us, I think for us, we feel a tremendous amount of pride in thinking about how we spend that in a really meaningful way in our communities. I don't think we've got it right, but I think we have to both build those communities and those social value companies up from the bottom to give them the capacity that they need. We probably at some point have to have a fairly tricky conversation about if we do relax some of the restrictions about how we spend the money, it is possible that some of those small companies might not survive. What is the risk and reward we're willing to take around that? Because at the minute, we don't really have the ability to take much risk at all. So we don't know what that trade-off is. And as somebody who's both in the role I'm in, but also pays taxes, I feel both those things quite acutely, actually, about how you're going to get that balance right. And then finally, I think for our combined authority, we're talking about having a single settlement, which is 5 pillars of funding coming to the region with some fungibility between all 5 and working to delivering a set of outcomes. And the true measure of whether that will be successful, whether fiscal devolution will really work in places like Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, will be about whether the relaxation around some of those restrictions, we administer, I think, 92 grants at the moment. They all have different sets of rules and restrictions to them. But actually with 5 pots of funding and some flexibility about it, will we really be able to work with Treasury through our negotiations to sort of let us off the leash a little bit and give us some of those trade-offs and flexibilities to see if we can make a more meaningful impact than the impact we're currently able to make.
Thank you very much. Some really interesting perspectives there from the sharp end, trying to make all this work. Sarah, over to you to kind of give us that experience from your membership, but also the kind of the technology and the implementation of some of these ideas.
Hopefully this is working. So it's been amazing to hear all the comments around data, but I think that data comment, if it doesn't have stands. I've heard the word interoperability twice this afternoon already, which is like gobsmacking. So you're in a situation where if that data can't be trusted, then we're in a really critical point, because there is no point in measuring it if it can't be used interoperably. If we can't measure apples with apples, then it is genuinely just a waste of time. And what we do at GS1 UK is we enable that transparency across supply chains, which again, how do we make supply chains really come to life in this piece? Because if we can't identify, capture, and share the information that is captured throughout that supply chain, from where a product is originating to where it's actually being consumed, then there isn't a hope in us actually being able to comply with any of the legislation that's there. And so we assist small businesses and large businesses to tap into that, which will then allow us to address some of these problems and to build back that trust. One of the scariest pieces of data that Hana had pulled out of this is 2/3 of the people that we spoke to just don't believe that people are telling them the truth when it comes to these claims. Now, that is absolutely awful. And without that trust, there will be no engagement with your consumers or with any of the community, because if they don't trust you, they're not going to engage. Without that engagement, there is no way that you're going to be able to demonstrate the importance of the value that you're actually creating with any credibility whatsoever. And we were looking at some data earlier today, and it goes down even into specific areas. So we saw some data where 66% of people that were surveyed believe that the NHS is wasting cash right now at a time when it's completely critical. And that's vested in the fact that they haven't got the data at their fingertips to prove that what they're spending is being done collaboratively, is being done with credibility, and also can be demonstrated, and to your point, can be measured. And I think the last point to do that is we need to redefine this value for money equation. And value for money at its heart has always been about, price plus service. And I think there's an element where that price piece is going to start to be replaced by purpose. And we know that businesses with a purpose are much more likely to succeed. They're much more likely to drive loyalty from their consumer base. And they're much more likely to be able to contribute to the world that we have around us. So looking at how that equation and how we can redefine value in this new context around purpose, I think is a really great way to us demonstrating the value of how this data can be put into a really commercial mindset that will make an impact not just for the communities that we serve, but also for those businesses. And they need to start to rethink about those commercial models and how they've been measuring their worth up until now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah. And your point about purpose as well, I mean, obviously we are now in the home of mission-led government. You were talking about the missions earlier. You're looking for tools to implement the missions. Again, I mean, the procurement budget, some of the issues we're talking about is the way you can steer businesses in creating that. But as you say, Sarah, it's got to be based on trust and that ability to read across and really measure, as you say, apples with apples and oranges with oranges. I really want to get into the questions from the audience. I'm sure there'll be lots of them and comments around this particular agenda, but just one very quickly to various aspects of the panel. Something that keeps coming up is around capacity for SMEs to engage with procurement, capacity of people working in government to understand social value and to implement it effectively. You know, we've kind of got over, I think Labour's particularly been very strong on investing in HMRC, for example, and recognising that sometimes you've got to invest in the kind of the government's capacity and the state's capacity to do something, and you can get big returns, even if it looks like a short-term cost, but you've got to hire more people and invest in those systems. Is there a similar argument you think we can make effectively around this work? Because collecting more data, supporting SMEs, enabling that interoperability and standardisation, it's not cost-free, but you know, a few £1 million investment for over a £300 million kind of sector is seems a pretty good return to me in terms of some of the impact you might achieve. So perhaps Meg, starting with yourself, given you've been lobbying so much around professionalisation and improvement of procurement in government, do you think there's more that we can do on that?
Yes, and I think if you look at the cost, it's probably a rounding error in a procurement budget. It's like with evaluation, you know, you often things that seem like an extra thing. Actually, there's that program of 1% for art, 1% for every building constructed. And it was quite successful because it actually wasn't very much money really. I mean, in comparison, it was easy to trim that out of the budget without any major effects. So I think it's certainly possible. I think one of the things here is a hassle factor, especially for smaller businesses, and I think that needs to be a whole different look at how social value is delivered by them, because they're often, I think of like my constituency, 95% of businesses employ 306 people, often very ethically focused, very thoughtful about the community they're from, they want to know who they're selling, but you know, they have limited capacity, so they've got all the right intentions, but I think we need to look at the different sizes of business and think what we want from them. So I do think that getting data right is challenging. I remember when I was in the Home Office, there was someone called we came along and did a review of all the data in the criminal justice system. He showed me the picture. It was like this weird, this sort of organogram, sort of spider web of data, and it was incredible. So what the prison service collected from prisoners who left, as they sort of filled in the form when they left, didn't match up with if their immigration status was recorded. It didn't match up with anything that the way the Home Office reported it. So no wonder we had prisoners released without being deported. And anyway, and pretty much every bit of data was on a different form, and we were trying to look at whether we could have some commonality. So we've now got more technology these days that should make this thing easier, but it's got to be something that's just written in as business as usual, so that it isn't difficult. So actually, if you think about it now, small businesses used to have an accountant, have to all sorts of get their receipts together, and doing their tax was a really painful thing. Now you have small businesses with an app on their phone that does it for them. So I think there are ways we can use technology just to make it business as usual. And then once you've got that data, then we can start to tell the story. And just on the data and story thing, I think it reminds me of I remember some women coming to my surgery around the Olympics, in 2012 in my patch, and they said, our boys, I think they were teenagers, 18-year-olds, can't get a job, and we want them to train to be plumbers and carpenters. They were promised there would be jobs and training for the Olympics. So, and I was puzzled because they lived right on the Olympic site. They were awful. And so I kept meeting the Olympics people. Diana, and I took it up with bigger, saying, where are I local? They said, no, it's fine. We've been collecting the data. Said, the data is the postcodes where people live. Anyway, I then found, did a bit of digging, and what was happening was people would either genuinely were living in a rented room somewhere in Epping, or they just worked out that they could pretend they lived in a rented room. They just needed to give a postcode, basically, and that was the data that was being recorded. So the data was being recorded, but it wasn't real. So I think that's one of the things that we will look for. People will game it if it's difficult, and we're going to make sure that people don't.
Thank you very much. I know the Treasury is always sceptical of investor save arguments, but there might be an investor to save argument here, or investor grow the impact essentially.
Well, tempting is making fiscal commitments from the stage meeting. That's always, it's very easy to make it be very short-term popular, long-term more bottom. I would say I'd push back on that framing there. I think if you look at some of the announcements that have come forward in the last few weeks, actually, the Treasury has been very willing to make investor save decisions that have been deferred and ignored, sometimes pretty nonsensically, for quite some time. I think yesterday, if you look at the extra resources being put into HMRC to make sure it's got the capacity to go after tax fraud and evasion, significant extra back office capacity, not particularly sexy things to argue for, or civil servants and HMRC, but actually something that we know will more than pay for itself, delivering a tax system that we can all have more trust in and more money for us to then be able to deploy public services that we've put here to invest in. So I'm not going to comment on this overtly specifically, but I would push back on the notion that where there aren't very robust and comprehensive investor save arguments, this Treasury isn't doing anything other than hearing and listening to them and digging into them.
So a bit of optimism there, perhaps, and we can kind of keep making some of these arguments. But I'm very conscious of time, and I know some of the panel have to leave a little bit earlier. But I might try and take some from the floor. Wow, okay, excellent. So we've got a couple over here, and we've got about 4 over here. So we'll try and get through as many as we can. But do you two want to start, and then we'll distribute them around? Oh, okay. These 3 on this side, then we'll get to this.
Hi, I'm Piers Neal from the Business Services Association. Firstly, brilliant report. Yeah, very pleased to see it, and it's brilliant work, so thank you. Alistair, you referenced the stability that public sector contracts can provide, for SMEs in particular, but a big part of this is dependent on the publication of timely and accurate pipelines from contracting authorities for the projects and services that they want private sector partners to deliver. This then allows primes to curate their social value partners, develop their supply chain, and have them ready to deliver the social value that we want from this. So does the panel agree that the government should support the adoption of the principles set out in the sourcing playbook, including the commitment to publication of these timely and accurate pipelines? And what will be done in this space to make sure that we get those pipelines and we understand the work that needs to be done?
Great question. Gentleman just behind.
Thanks. I'm Nick Small. I'm a councillor in Liverpool, and also sort of work professionally in social impact. It was a really good report. I'd be keen to hear the panel's view around sort of local growth plans, which I think is a huge opportunity here, to lock in social value and to do things differently, but to do things in a more impactful way. And I'd be keen to hear people's perspective as to what needs to be done at sort of combined authority local government level on that.
I think there's a question with your name on it there, Laura. Let's see what the final, just that lady there. Sorry, there's 2 now. One behind and we're digging. That side.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Gail Irvin. I'm from the Living Wage Foundation. And thank you. This is really interesting panel. It looks like a really thoughtful and interesting framing on this question about procurement and social value. I think I'm interested, 2 quick cheeky questions. Interested in the panel's view on like prescriptiveness versus the freedom to try and promote different social outcomes. I guess from the Living Wage Foundation, one thing we would like to see, for example, is all public sector contracts and ensuring that the real living wage is paid in those jobs that are dispersed around the country at a minimum. My second question is on the question of national leadership. What do you think is the urgency, and like what's going to be the main vehicle to try and drive this forward? Because of course there's lots of good local and regional examples and ability to act on social value procurement, but it's maybe not the biggest retail offer so far, and I haven't had much clarity on, is the social value council, is that going to be prioritised, what timing, procurement, what will happen in the bill when that comes, what will that focus on? So just interested in perspectives on national leadership to enable all of this. Thank you.
And there was just one more, this lady again, a quick question, and we'll try and take those.
Thank you. My name is Lola. I work for an organisation called Green New Deal Rising, which is a youth environmental non-profit. I work with volunteers across the country, and I'm a young person myself, and I'm curious about what was said, which was very interesting, about the challenges that people are finding when it comes to engaging with communities, both in terms of I suppose the kind of regulatory things, which mean it's difficult to do that work, which really engages with community-based organisations and things like that. And I'd love to hear more about what the challenges and opportunities are that people see there, because we work with, lots of passionate young people who really care about social value and obviously the environment and protecting their futures. And so I'm curious about where you see potential for changes that can be made to really make sure that young people are engaged in these processes. So thank you.
Thank you. Alistair, I know you're going to leave very, very quickly. Any thoughts, particularly maybe on the national leadership one? I mean, who should kind of maybe, do you have a vision of who then really enters the Cabinet Office, Treasury? And it kind of cuts across quite a few different briefs, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's clearly cross-cutting, but I think by its nature it has to be, right? In the same way that we've very deliberately set up mission boards to bring people together right across government to drive forward things that we know will only succeed if every arm of the state is right behind them. If we're going to get human right, that is something that has to be golden thread through every aspect of state spending, every big department that's making big procurement decisions. In terms of the point on pipelines, I'm not going to pretend to be specifically very close to the board reference there, but I think what hopefully they've already started to see from government is respect for the principle that the more notice we can give around big funding decisions, the better outcome and value we're going to be able to drive from it, both in the spending review, the longer term fiscal settlements for local authorities that fall out of that in due course too. These are things that actually I think will be a very helpful way of unlocking and driving better value in the way we're spending money. And over time, I think that principle is a good one to then start thinking where other forms of state expenditure that marries to. On that note, I'm now definitely going to be late for my next event. Thank you all for taking time to chat with me.
Thank you very much. Thanks. And that's a mic drop moment there. I mean, I know reading probably far too many public account committee reports, so often you talk about that pipeline and stability and that forward notice and gearing systems up together. Do you feel we have made any progress on that? And what would you say to your colleagues now in government around giving some of that stability, which is quite important?
I think there's so much more that can be done here. And if you look at things like rail franchising, which we were one of the first committees the PAC to say was bust, and the Transport Committee chaired by Conservative Green very quickly, because there are examples where the contracting process would take so long that the data that wasn't always brilliant in the first place was well out of date 18 months, 2 years later when finally the contract went through. So timeliness is really important, but also the data that government has collected. So there's an example when, which is a Carillion example, but when they, at the time of the Ministry of Justice, it was procuring for an FM for prisons, and they didn't really count the windows and doors properly. So, not unreasonably, a contractor comes in thinking that this is the main windows, doors, toilets, whatever. And actually, the other thing is that it turns out that windows get smashed more often in prisons than they do in other public buildings. So, these are this is data that's like not just for the sake of it, this is actually quite rich stuff that you need to know. Now, what was interesting is once I visited Sydney, I have to say, paid for myself, it was a private holiday. But while I was on my private holiday, I went to meet the Culture Minister for New South Wales, because we were preparing for our Olympics. I thought it would be good to pick our brains. What they did then, and it was just really something that we should be doing far more of, I keep telling people about it, I don't think we've got anywhere near yet, is they went through everything that they would need for the Olympics in Sydney. And they broke it down. So the chairs we're sitting on, they break it down to need this many screws, and every item was broken down to its component parts. They then did presentations and work with businesses to get them geared up to bidding for these sorts of contracts, and helped think, well, actually, if you're building this widget, if you could change, re-engineer slightly, or reconfigure your equipment, could you just twist it a bit to deliver this very particular widget that's needed for the Olympics? So in order to boost businesses. Now, isn't that just like blinding the obvious? And just think, and of course, in that part of the world, it was very sensible to have your procurement as well right on the doorstep, because you don't be shipping it necessarily from the other side of the world. And so really, it was only a few countries were ever going to be in the bidding, but they made sure their businesses would geared up. And I think that that's something that could be done here and would help the social value. I just wanted to pick up briefly on the prescriptiveness versus freedoms. I think it needs to be mixed, because actually things like a living wage, I think, speaking as a Labour and Co-op MP, is absolutely fundamental. Too often, employers are getting away with paying low wages, and that's why we have to top them up with benefits of all sorts. I always think if the answer is a top up, whether everything from housing benefit to the household support fund, there's something wrong with the policy in the first place, ultimately. So we need to look at that. And so something like that should probably be fixed, like the London living wage, which took off its own well, through the campaigning really, it wasn't legislated for, but people felt that suddenly, they would be embarrassed if they didn't do it. So that in fact wasn't prescriptive. I would say maybe we should make that sort of thing prescriptive, but other things maybe not, a bit more mixed, because it might depend on the area of the country. Apprenticeships in different parts of the country might be different, might need to be more than others. And then I was just going to pick up on the this issue about engaging with communities. Simply, I think it's devolved down to the most appropriate local level, so that you give local government a pot of money and then you give them the freedom to spend it without. Now, this is the problem with central government. So we all come into power and we say we're going to have devolution. So both the Conservatives said this and Labour, and then you get in and then you've suddenly got your missions and you've got your targets and you're being held to account by the Prime Minister or the Chancellor, and you're called in and you're told to explain exactly what you delivered, and then you're kind of terribly worried that if you give it away to dastardly people like the Mayor of the West Midlands or the Mayor of Greater Manchester, who might go do something different with it and not spend it properly, and then you're in trouble on the hook for it. And actually, we've just got to trust that we've got damn good people in those jobs and in local government and at local level. And a very simple example of this was when in Peterborough, the Department, Ministry for Justice, actually went over 2 different governments, interestingly, decided to look at what it could do to help prisoners stop recidivism among prisoners. So they decided to pilot, always a good thing in my book, and they did it in Peterborough, and they got local organisations on the ground to work out what they needed to do to stop people going to prison. And one of the simple things, they got ex-prisoners, meeting prisoners as they left Peterborough prison with their 50 quid in their hand and their sort of resettlement money, walking down the high street, and those prisoners didn't give it to the local drug dealer because the person taking them down the road had been on that journey themselves. So actually, that's one example. I mean, there are others that someone mentioned to me this week, and I remembered some of that. And I thought, this is an exact example about how you go local. On the prison thing, again, we looked at it on the Public Accounts Committee. Women in prisons are spread very thin because there aren't many women in prison. So something like that would be more of a national discussion. But nationally, we should be saying, actually, rather than let this all be done locally, because there's too few women in a local area, it might be a national group that can really help deliver for women who are released from prison. So you can look at all the millions of examples like that. I'm sure Laura has plenty, but give Laura, her team, and the mayors who are elected, the people who are elected, the power and freedom to make those decisions, because they know what works in their area. I think we should. So I believe that good politics is giving power away, giving money away, watching it very closely, of course, but not being too afraid to devolve.
And only you, Meg, could go on holiday to Australia and start talking to people about procurement while you're out.
Very sad life, I think.
Yeah, well, I'd have claimed that. Laura, local plans, growth plans, and I think, really interesting question about that.
I think they all come back together at some level, and absolutely to devolve, and we might then devolve it down to the community.
Exactly.
But also, I think we should be talking about holding mayors to account at public accounts committees as well, and think about the kind of budget we're talking about. With greater responsibility comes greater accountability, and I think those 2 things need to happen now as we're moving to this model. But that a bit about coming back to place. If local growth plans are about places, and the places define what are in their local growth plans, and they're very specific about their local needs, then I think that will actually give quite a good framework for thinking about how that funding then is allocated through to place. And what we're doing in the West Midlands is work with our local authorities as they draw place-based plans, but we're asking them to think about everything in the round. So it could be everything from social impact to infrastructure in its widest sense, whether it's housing or transport or digital or social, and what needs to happen in those places. And then local growth plans should be about what that place wants to deliver in its locality. And then the procurement, how we spend money, needs to continue to invest in it. In terms of young people, we have a young combined authority, which is great. They attend our combined authority, they go over policies, but I'm always just conscious. Those are people who know there's a young combined authority. They're people who are already civically minded, who've sought out how to get involved in a young combined authority. So we're hearing from politically active people as well. And I think that's more our challenge, is how do we or the community, the organizations that we work with the people who are maybe not only not aware, but also not interested, or actively disinterested in talking to some of those organizations. And then again, that's just where we're too far away from the community to know how we make those things matter in those places. And then I haven't read your report, I'm sorry, but the longer term settlement we have, so we're building our tram system. You know, when we got a new devolved settlement from government, which is a real step change for us over 5 years, we could then think, oh, well, we're going to build more than one line. We're going to build 2 lines. Actually, we can recruit apprentices because we can keep them on over 1 to 2. It gives the certainty to the pipeline. It gives certainty to the supply chain, but it also gives certainty to employers to be able to say, oh, there's you know, this isn't just a job for a year that you're giving an apprentice. Actually, this job could be 5 years and possibly 10. So the more certainty, the more impact, I would say. So hopefully I've picked up a couple of those.
That's great. Sarah, you got any thoughts on those questions?
So I think just one piece, I think unlocking the small business community, because they are so much closer to their purpose and to their to the customers that they serve, and they've got great opportunity then through their own marketing needs. So many of them, 97% of them are now trading using social channels. So they serve a local community, but they also serve our great ability as a nation to trade. And I'll have a conversation with you about screws and widgets afterwards, saying, because loads and loads of stories to tell on that. But I think
Can I just make one more comment? I forgot to make. Sorry. But you asked for some of that question earlier about investing in them, and I was thinking about small tech firms. And there's a whole service industry about helping them with angel investors and getting over the valley of death, and how do we make sure small tech firms grow into something that employs. It's just simply that we don't collectively have the will to apply that same sort of thinking to the social economy sector.
Yeah.
You know, we provide that kind of help to all sorts of other sectors. So, you know, there is a model for it. It's just, it tends to be only when it provides a return to, you know, to a profit-making company as opposed to a social return. So we think about that differently.
Thank you, Laura. And obviously in the report, you did lay out kind of citizens panels and kind of more engagement opportunities. Do you want any kind of reflections on how we can get the public more involved in some of this work?
Yeah, just to kind of build on what's been said so far, I think, you know, it's definitely about engaging communities, but engaging them in the right way. And as you say, not the people that are kind of always, you know, going to be shouting the loudest that you're already hearing from. That's why things like citizens panels are great, because you're recruiting people, you're paying them. They're people that are, you know, not really interested in social value, don't know what it is, and they're literally just to, you know, get a bit of money. But that's weirdly actually great, because it means they're just normal people, and you're bringing together kind of these people you're not generally hearing from, and kind of getting them to kind of co-design what social value should look like in this community. So I think there's lots of methods like that are really exciting. We do lots of work on that. I don't know, interesting.
Thank you. I'm just conscious testing the audience participation, so we'll take a couple of questions and we'll make them really, really snappy. And then there's plenty of time. We've got the room for a little while, so you can do some networking. You can kind of chat to panelists if you like. But yes, you say you've been very patient there, and you met me there. Sorry, sir.
Hello, I'm a businessman. I own pharmacies between Liverpool and Saddleworth across the northwest. The social value of pharmacies is that it keeps people living independently in their own homes for longer. We see 1.6 million people a day, just a week. And we have a model that's called incentivized procurement, whereby it's a profit share with the NHS, and it saves the public purse roughly about 14 billion a year, which is about 80% of the drugs bill. And it's probably the reason why we have the lowest costs of medicines in the whole entire OECD countries. So my question, or is it a plea, I'm not sure, but I hope you're listening, because if you really do want to reduce the demand on primary care and community care, think of pharmacy. If you want to improve productivity, think of pharmacy. I know Amanda Pritchard said around about 2%, was it last year? We could do way more than that, but it involves, as somebody said earlier, I think it was Sarah, investing to save in pharmacy. And the final point, and I think this is perhaps the most important, if you want to create growth that's sustainable and equitable, look no further than pharmacy. Because pharmacy is a very underutilized resource in this country, and the only thing holding it back is prejudices and personal views. And I'm thinking now of NHS England and Department of Health. If you can break that and have the courage to break that, my God, have you got a resource here? And I should know. I've been a pharmacist for 40 years. I know how it works, and I know the difference I make to these communities.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for your work. Sorry, you know, and so there was more of a comment than a question, so I'm going to let you ask the question. Yeah, as well. It was a great comment. It was a great comment, and a lot of endorsement for it. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm Eleanor Rosenbach from the Corporate Justice Coalition. And one of the things I wanted to draw attention to was the importance of transparency and accountability and social value, not just in terms of public spending in the UK, but also in our global supply chains. Because the hard truth at the moment is that much money spent in public procurement is implicated in some really egregious human rights and environmental abuses across the world. And I don't believe that anybody involved in public procurement wants there to be slave labour or forced labour or environmental degradation implicated in the goods and products that we use. But unless we have real transparency and accountability in our supply chains and consider social value, not just in terms of the UK, but people and planet across the world, we can't achieve that. So my question really is, does the panel agree that we need to extend these concepts and these ideas to people and planet across the world?
And then you, sir.
Mark Dora, we bid for adult skills delivery nationally and regionally. We don't bid in the West Midlands because even though we employ staff from the West Midlands and have lots of demand, we don't have a centre there because we're an online provider. So, I mean, how do you measure social value? Lots of different types. How do you score it? Do you award someone a contract because they've got 10 apprentices, but the prison falls down? You know, what's the balance? And I wonder whether a different approach is actually to almost have like an IIP approach, where anyone that wants to bid is demonstrating what social value they do anyway. So then you've got all companies delivering that social value rather than just the ones that win the tender.
So any just questions? I mean, look at that. I think an awful thing as a chair actually to answer a question, because I think it's really important. Very, very quickly. I think you make a good point about human rights abuses and so on. However, I think social value is social value, and actually things that you're saying now, it's just a law and we should be implementing them. I know the last government, for example, on social value study including modern slavery.
Yes,
modern slavery is just evil, and it should, no company should be getting points for enforcing the law. And it's like, so yeah, things like human rights abuses, we should just not enforce.
We more than just illegal, even on the PPE contract, even some were rejected because of any if they found any implication, because it was going very fast.
Yeah.
Not all the checks were done quite in the right time, not fine. I won't go into the whole PPE thing, but some were rejected because of that. So some of the ones that were in dispute were because they were just going to tap that anything, so they were out. That was it.
So yeah, so I think there is that point around how do we maximise environmental social benefits, which I completely agree with, and I think there is also enforcing the law and good standards, and we should keep the two completely separate in that sense. I think sometimes businesses do kind of try and game the system a bit and go, well, you've got to follow all these regulations and we get some points for doing our job in following the regulations. I think that's the kind of the green wash and the social wash, which really starts to irritate people. But it's a great point, I think, that we need to enforce those rules, but focus social value on the added value and the benefits, like the apprenticeships you were talking about, the jobs and pharmacy, talking about prevention, all that kind of work. That's the positive stuff. And then you need a robust system for making sure that we don't have human rights abuses and modern slavery, and we achieve net zero and so on. That's the legal basis. Everyone should be meeting the minimum standard. This is about doing more than the minimum.
Just to add to that though, until as consumers we give a shit about this stuff, we're never actually going to make that difference.
Completely. Yeah.
And the only way we can do that is by giving consumers the information that they say they want in order that they can then do what they say they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And there is legislation coming around things like digital product passports, so that you can actually trace a t-shirt that's cost £1, God knows how, from where it's grown through, and then take it back into the environment. Completely get it. So we shouldn't need legislation to always do what is so inherently the right thing, but we need to give people that visibility to make those informed choices. And I think that's where the standardisation around product data is completely critical to doing that piece. And then just to add to that, the Big Four are looking at new ways that they audit organisations. They can audit a P&L because they're quite good at adding up, most of them. But what you're then in a situation whereby the claims that are going for the ESG elements of these large submissions in the annual reports, they haven't got slightly take my language out of it, they haven't got a robust mechanic for auditing that infrastructure and proving that claims that have been made on origins are actually true. And there's some work going on in that space, but I think that really needs to be accelerated.
Very good. I'm going to sort of ask people to respond to some of the questions if they want to, and just maybe give some kind of final thoughts and wrap it all up together as well in an open bow. And then we can finish this event off. Megan, I'll come to you last, give you a chance to reflect on that. Hannah, any kind of thoughts on the questions? And then
Yeah, just on that last point, I mean, yes, they're different, the sort of things that are illegal, social value, but of course, they're linked in that more transparency will also, in supply chains, will help us understand the bad stuff that's going on. So they can only help each other, but completely agree that they should be separate. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Just to add to the spice.
Another good point on transparency. Laura.
So I've learned something about pharmacies, for one, which I didn't know, so thank you. That's actually really interesting. Agreed. I mean, we just shouldn't be doing business with companies that don't do good business. So completely agree. Often it is, I think, sort of comes to your point. Often it's hidden down their subcontracting supply chain. So sometimes it is really complicated between sort of who's the applicant, and then if they subcontract to, and then you find out actually they've subcontracted to somebody that you wouldn't have contracted with, and then how you enforce that. But again, and then I think your point I would just agree with as well, which is if it's out in the contract, everybody has to demonstrate how they're doing it, so it doesn't become something that's added on, which is the point, which is it's actually part and parcel of what we demand as consumers, as employers, as people who procure and spend public money. It's got to be what we demand from. It's got to be what we demand from business, because otherwise they have absolutely no incentive to change.
Great thought. And Meg, kind of your thoughts on any questions and concluding thoughts for us.
Well, just on the pharmacy point, Steve Race, the new MP for Exeter, has been very on this. And I think the gentleman's MP is not a fan of their local pharmacies. And in my area, that's people who will find it sometimes, very difficult to get a GP appointment, but often pharmacists will speak their community language as well, so there's all sorts of reasons, just a bit less intimidating to go in. And of course, pharmacies were absolutely heroic and still are delivering vaccines on the high street. So that's where I get my vaccines from, my local pharmacy. So so yes, and more generally, I think there is a real opportunity here. And one of the things about this is that I think if we go outside this room and talk to a few people on the street, if you're and said, do you know about the Social Value Act? They might just not know about it. So I think we've got a bit of a job to do, because also the new government's come in. I came as minister, and I was a minister when we'd already been in government for a while, so lots of people knew what they're doing. And not that they don't know what they're doing, but it is a big shock. You walk through the doors of the department, you think you're prepared on certain key things. There's a stupid sort of focus on the first 100 days, it's stupid, but it's just like first 100 days, if you're not in the first 100 days, and actually there's an awful lot to do and all the missions to deliver. And if we're going to deliver anything like the ambitions that Keir set out today, that Rachel's setting out, we'll see economic growth and all that, but actually there's an awful lot of money that's being spent in the system that could be used and could be that catalyst for some of those things that we want to see. And this is one of those things. And I think this report is very timely, as Alistair said, and I think that we need to be banging the drum about this. So I'm not going to commit my committee to looking at it, though I am tempted, but I can't have a full committee yet. So I'm not going to clog up our time with things that I'm promising, or I might be chair for very long. Well, I don't think they can kick me out, but I'm going to be very happy working with me. I'm just telling them what to do. But I'm a co-op MP, so it is very much very much my area, one of my areas of interest. But it seems, I think, when you've got the pressures in government, we've got to also win the hearts and minds of ministers to make sure that they are mentioning this every time they're talking to their procurement specialists. And that issue about data and transparency. If we're going to get people in Liverpool or whichever high street to know what this is, we don't say the Social Value Act. We say, look, your local combined with your council or government procured this, and your son and your daughter got an apprenticeship, or whatever the benefit is, or we helped support another small business, and the social benefits need to be real human stories, and I think that will then sell the change.
Well, that's a great way to end on this. Ultimately, we call this a £300 billion opportunity, but it really is about, as you say, there's real human stories. It's the jobs created, it's the green spaces created, it's the carbon emissions that are reduced that keep our planet healthy for longer. Big thank you to Hana for writing the report and presenting on it, to our panel, Hillier, Alistair Strathern, Laura Shoaf, and Sarah Atkins from GS1 UK. We're getting brilliant partners on this and really got on the journey with us and added a lot of useful expertise and value. I do recommend you check out GS1 UK's work and find out more about it. Sarah, brilliant, fascinating organisation. This is the last of it that we're doing a party conference, so thank you all very much for coming. And it's a great one to finish on. And just thank you to everyone who's come to all of our events so far, because it's been a really great set of conversations. And I hope you have a really great rest of the conference, hope you spend it, and good trips home when you get there. And I think we'll all be looking forward to taking these conversations forward, back in Westminster, back in our businesses, back in our councils and our jobs. So thank you so much. Thank you. No.